November 19, 1943, the waters off Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. Commander James Russell stood on the flight deck of USS Essex, watching his deck crew position aircraft for the morning strike with a precision that had taken months of combat experience to develop. 36 Hellcat fighters, 36 Helldiver dive bombers, 18 Avenger torpedo bombers, 90 aircraft that needed to be spotted, armed, fueled, and launched before the Japanese could react. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The doctrine called it the deck load strike. Everything the carrier could throw at the enemy in a single, overwhelming punch. But 18 months earlier, at the Battle of Midway, American carriers had launched aircraft in what pilots called penny packets. Small groups straggling into battle alone, uncoordinated, dying without mutual support. Essex and her sister ships were about to prove that American naval aviation had learned its lessons in blood. What commanders at Pearl Harbor did not yet fully understand was that across the fast carrier task force operating throughout the Pacific, flight deck crews were quietly revolutionizing naval air operations through innovations born from combat necessity. Their improvements would transform carrier warfare from tentative raids into sustained campaigns that would carry the war to Tokyo itself. But first, they would have to prove their methods worked under fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The genesis of the crisis began not with failure, but with unexpected success. When USS Essex entered service in December 1942, she represented the culmination of years of carrier design evolution. At 872 feet, and long with a displacement of over 33,000 tons, she dwarfed the Yorktown-class carriers that had fought at Midway. Her flight deck measured 862 feet by 147 feet. More critically, her designers had positioned one elevator at the deck edge rather than on the centerline, keeping the flight deck clear for operations even when moving aircraft between the hangar and flight deck. The theoretical capability impressed everyone. Essex could embark 90 aircraft organized into 4 complete squadrons. Planners at the Bureau of Aeronautics had developed the concept they called the Sunday Punch. Spot every available aircraft on the flight deck, warm engines, launch the entire strike within minutes. Deliver overwhelming combat power against a single target before the enemy could react or reinforce. Theory crashed against reality during Essex's first combat operations at Marcus Island in August 1943. The strike plan called for launching 60 aircraft in the first wave. Flight deck crews began spotting aircraft at 0400 hours. It took them 50 minutes just to position the aircraft, another 30 minutes for engine warm-up and pre-flight checks. When the launch finally began at 0530, each aircraft took between 45 and 60 seconds to clear the deck. The entire process consumed nearly 2 hours from first movement to last aircraft airborne, 2 hours during which the carrier steamed in predictable patterns into the wind, vulnerable to submarine attack. 2 hours during which Japanese radar operators could track the launch and vector interceptors to meet the strike. 2 hours that gave away every advantage of surprise that carrier aviation was supposed to provide. Captain Donald Duncan commanded Essex during those early operations. He recognized immediately that something fundamental needed to change. The problem was not equipment or courage. Essex's deck crews worked with a determination that impressed even veteran observers. The problem was coordination. Pre-war carrier doctrine had evolved during peacetime fleet exercises when a single carrier operated alone or with one partner. Flight deck procedures reflected that environment. The Air Department controlled aircraft movement. The Operations Department planned missions. The Engineering Department managed fuel and electrical systems. Each department operated according to its own procedures with minimal integration. This worked adequately when launching a dozen fighters for combat air patrol or a single squadron for reconnaissance. It failed catastrophically when attempting to launch 90 aircraft in a coordinated strike while simultaneously recovering aircraft from the previous mission and preparing for the next launch cycle. The Japanese had faced this problem earlier, and solved it through intensive pre-war training. Their carriers operated as integrated systems where every crew member understood how their actions affected the entire launch cycle. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers had launched over 300 aircraft in 2 massive waves with a precision that American observers initially found impossible to believe. But Japanese training methods required years of practice during peacetime. American carriers entering service in 1943 did not have years. They had weeks between commissioning and combat deployment. Whatever solutions they developed would need to emerge from combat experience rather than careful peacetime experimentation. The breakthrough came not from formal studies or official directives, but from 2 officers aboard USS Hornet who understood that survival demanded innovation. Commander George Murray commanded Task Force 17, which included Hornet. Captain Charles Mason commanded the carrier itself. Both men had watched the chaotic launches at Marcus Island and Tarawa. Both recognized that the current procedures would get people killed. Murray and Mason began analyzing the problem systematically. They broke down the deck load strike into its component parts. Aircraft storage in the hangar, movement to the flight deck via elevators, spotting in launch positions, engine start and warm-up, pre-flight inspections, arming weapons, launch sequence. Each step represented potential delay or failure point. The critical insight came from examining how aircraft were organized for launch. Pre-war doctrine grouped aircraft by type: all fighters together, all dive bombers together, all torpedo bombers together. This made administrative sense. Fighter squadrons worked together, bomber squadrons trained together, but it created operational chaos during launches. Here was the problem. Fighters needed less deck space than bombers. They warmed up faster. They required less fuel. But under existing procedures, they launched after the bombers simply because that is how the manual specified strike composition. Bombers with their heavier fuel loads and ordnance occupied deck positions, while nimble fighters waited in the hangar. The fastest aircraft in the fleet sat idle while slower, heavier aircraft clogged the deck. Murray proposed a radical restructuring based on operational requirements rather than administrative convenience. Organize aircraft into functional groups rather than type groups. Create a combat air patrol flight permanently spotted for immediate launch. Create a strike escort flight of fighters already on deck, ready to accompany the first wave of bombers. Create a second strike flight in the hangar that could be brought up and launched while the first strike proceeded to target. The concept sounds obvious in retrospect. At the time, it violated everything the Navy had taught about carrier operations for 20 years. Squadron commanders objected that splitting their aircraft between deck and hangar complicated maintenance and reduced unit cohesion. Air Department officers argued that mixing aircraft types on the deck created safety hazards during launch. Operations officers pointed out that the proposed system required significantly more coordination between departments than existing procedures mandated. Murray's response was characteristically blunt. The current system gets carriers sunk. This system might keep us alive long enough to win the war. Which do you prefer? Captain Mason implemented Murray's system aboard Hornet during November 1943. The changes seemed subtle on paper, but revolutionized operations in practice. Fighter aircraft were organized into 4 flights of 8 aircraft each. The first flight remained permanently spotted at the bow, engines warm, pilots in cockpits, ready for immediate launch if Japanese aircraft appeared on radar. The second flight sat on the deck immediately aft of the combat air patrol position, armed and fueled for strike escort duty. The third flight waited in the hangar, positioned near the elevators for rapid movement to the flight deck. The fourth flight served as reserve, conducting maintenance or standing down. This system provided immediate benefits. Combat air patrol could launch within 3 minutes of radar contact with incoming Japanese aircraft. Strike escorts launched with the first wave of bombers, providing protection from the moment the formation assembled, rather than rendezvousing en route to target. The third flight could be brought up and launched within 20 minutes to reinforce the strike or respond to emerging threats. More importantly, the system recognized that carrier operations were continuous rather than episodic. Aircraft returned from missions needing fuel and ammunition. New missions required different ordnance loads. Mechanical issues required aircraft replacement. The old system treated each launch as an independent event. Murray's system treated the carrier as a continuously operating factory, where aircraft moved through predictable cycles of maintenance, arming, launch, recovery, and return to service. The test came during operations in the Marshall Islands in January 1944. Hornet, operating with Essex and Yorktown in Task Group 58.1, faced the challenge of supporting amphibious landings at Kwajalein, while simultaneously suppressing Japanese air bases throughout the Marshall Island chain. The mission required launching strikes every 2 hours throughout daylight, while maintaining constant combat, air patrol overhead, and ready reserves for unexpected threats. Under the old system, this would have been impossible. Continuous operations would have created cascading delays as returning aircraft competed for deck space with outbound strikes. Under Murray's system, each returning flight knew exactly where to land and how quickly to clear the landing area. Deck crews knew exactly which aircraft moved to which positions. Ordnance teams knew which aircraft required which weapons loads. The carrier operated with the precision of a factory assembly line. The results spoke clearly. During the first day of operations at Kwajalein on January 29, 1944, Hornet launched 217 sorties. This represented more than twice her total aircraft complement. She achieved this through rapid turnaround that kept aircraft cycling between flight deck and mission with minimal downtime. Her aircraft struck targets on Taroa Airfield in the morning, Kwajalein fortifications in the afternoon, and then shifted to combat air patrol and anti-submarine duties as darkness approached. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. More significantly, Hornet launched a full deckload strike of 82 aircraft in 38 minutes, from first aircraft airborne to last. This represented less than half the time Essex had required at Marcus Island 5 months earlier. The improvement came not from faster aircraft or more powerful catapults, but from better organization and coordination. Other carriers in Task Force 58 observed Hornet's performance and began adopting similar procedures. USS Lexington, which had commissioned in February 1943, implemented a modified version of Murray's system that emphasized even faster combat air patrol response. USS Yorktown developed procedures that allowed launching and recovering aircraft simultaneously, using careful choreography that kept returning aircraft clear of the bow launch area. These innovations spread through informal networks rather than official channels. Squadron commanders talked to their counterparts during brief port visits at Majuro or Ulithi. Deck crew chiefs compared notes during alongside refueling operations. Air Department officers shared lessons learned in cramped ready rooms between strikes. The Fast Carrier Task Force was learning and adapting faster than any formal training system could have accomplished. By summer 1944, the improvements had become so substantial that Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the Fast Carrier Task Force, ordered a systematic study of deck operations across all carriers under his command. The resulting report, compiled in August 1944, documented the transformation that had occurred through combat experience. Average time from first aircraft movement to full deckload airborne had decreased from 110 minutes in August 1943 to 47 minutes in August 1944. Combat air patrol response time had improved from 12 minutes to less than 4 minutes. Daily sortie rates had increased from an average of 1.3 sorties per embarked aircraft to 2.1 sorties per aircraft. These improvements came without any changes to the carriers themselves or their aircraft. They resulted purely from better procedures developed through combat necessity. The report identified specific innovations that contributed to improved performance. Flight deck crews had developed a system of colored jerseys to identify different specialties. Yellow shirts directed aircraft movement, red shirts handled ordnance, purple shirts managed fuel, green shirts operated catapults and arresting gear, blue shirts served as plane handlers and chock crews, white shirts provided medical services and safety observation. This color coding allowed instant visual identification of personnel function, which dramatically improved coordination during the organized chaos of flight operations. Aircraft handling procedures had evolved to minimize deck congestion. Instead of moving aircraft individually as needed, deck crews developed standardized patterns that moved multiple aircraft simultaneously. They treated the flight deck like a chessboard where every move was planned 3 steps ahead. Aircraft returning from missions taxied to specific positions based on their fuel state and battle damage. Those needing immediate maintenance went to port-side forward positions near the island where mechanics could access them quickly. Those ready for rapid turnaround moved to starboard positions where arming and fueling teams waited. The report also documented innovations in maintenance procedures. Pre-war doctrine held that significant maintenance work should be performed in the hangar deck, where mechanics had better access and protection from weather. Combat experience proved this created bottlenecks. By mid-1944, carriers were conducting much more maintenance on the flight deck, even during active operations. Mechanics worked on parked aircraft between launch and recovery cycles, replacing components, patching battle damage, and conducting inspections. This kept more aircraft in flyable condition rather than tied up below decks waiting for hangar space. Perhaps most significantly, the report identified improved coordination between departments as the single greatest factor in operational efficiency. The barriers that had separated Air Department from Operations Department, from Engineering Department, had dissolved under combat pressure. Personnel from different departments worked together seamlessly. Air Department officers sat in Combat Information Center, where they could integrate flight operations with radar picture and tactical situation. Engineering personnel stationed representatives on the flight deck to address mechanical issues immediately, rather than waiting for reports through formal channels. Admiral Mitcher distributed the report throughout the Fast Carrier Task Force with instructions to implement proven procedures across all carriers. This represented unusual wisdom for a military organization. Rather than mandating standardized procedures from headquarters, Mitcher recognized that the best innovations had emerged from combat experience at deck level. His role was to identify and disseminate proven practices, while allowing individual carriers to continue adapting and improving. The system Mitcher endorsed recognized that carrier operations required thinking sailors rather than automated procedures. Flight deck operations involved too many variables to reduce to a checklist. Weather conditions changed constantly. Aircraft mechanical status varied. Enemy threats appeared unpredictably. Successful operations required deck crews who understood underlying principles and could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. This philosophy proved prescient during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The largest carrier battle of the war would test whether American innovations in deck operations could match Japanese training and experience. The answer would determine control of the Central Pacific and the future course of the war. June 19, 1944. Task Force 58 positioned itself 70 miles west of Saipan in the Marianas, waiting for the battle everyone knew was coming. Aboard USS Lexington, Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded 15 carriers operating 891 aircraft. The Fast Carrier Task Force represented the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. Whether it could defeat a determined enemy remained to be proven. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa approached from the west with 9 carriers embarking 430 aircraft. Japanese plans called for coordinated strikes by carrier aircraft and land-based planes from Guam and nearby islands. The Americans would face attack from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming their defenses through sheer numbers. Japanese pilots would land at Guam after their strikes, refuel, rearm, and attack American carriers again during their return flights. The plan was brilliant. It would fail catastrophically. American radar detected the first Japanese strike at 10:00 hours on June 19, 150 miles west of the task force. Mitcher's response demonstrated how thoroughly American carrier operations had evolved. At 10:19 hours, he gave the order to launch all available fighters. Every carrier in Task Force 58 turned into the wind simultaneously. Within 23 minutes, 220 Hellcat fighters were airborne, stacked at altitudes between 12,000 and 24,000 feet, positioned to intercept the incoming Japanese strikes. This represented operational capability that would have been impossible 18 months earlier. Launching over 200 aircraft from 15 carriers in less than half an hour required precise coordination across the entire task force. Each carrier needed to launch its fighters without interfering with launches from nearby carriers. Aircraft needed to assemble into formations without creating mid-air collision hazards. Fighter directors needed to vector 200 aircraft to intercept positions using radar information that updated every few seconds. The deck operations innovations developed during the previous year made this possible. Flight deck crews aboard each carrier understood exactly which aircraft launched first, second, third. Colored jerseys allowed instant visual identification of crew function even in the chaos of launching while under threat of imminent attack. Aircraft handlers positioned fighters for rapid launch using procedures they had practiced hundreds of times during previous operations. The system worked because it had been tested, refined, and proven through repeated combat experience. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, poorly trained compared to their American counterparts, flew obsolete aircraft against well-trained Americans flying superior Hellcats, guided by radar and fighter directors. The result was slaughter. American fighters shot down 42 Japanese aircraft from the first raid at the cost of 1 Hellcat. The second Japanese raid lost 97 aircraft, the third raid lost 47, the fourth raid lost 73. By the end of June 19th, Japan had lost over 300 carrier aircraft and pilots. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. The kill ratio was over 10-1 in favor of the Americans. This represented not merely superior equipment or pilot training, though both contributed significantly. It demonstrated that American carrier operations had reached a level of coordination and efficiency that the Japanese could no longer match. The battle continued on June 20th when Micha launched strikes against Ozawa's retreating carriers. The ranges involved tested American capabilities severely. Ozawa's fleet had withdrawn westward to distance beyond 300 miles from the American carriers. Launching strikes at this range meant aircraft would barely have sufficient fuel to return. Recovery would occur after sunset, requiring night landings that few pilots had practiced extensively. Micha accepted the risk because destroying the Japanese carrier fleet justified potential losses. At 1600 hours on June 20th, he launched 216 aircraft from 11 carriers. The strike flew 300 miles west, located Ozawa's fleet, and attacked. They sank the carrier Hio, damaged 2 other carriers, and sank 2 oilers, but the return flight occurred in darkness with fuel running critically low. The recovery operation that followed demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of American carrier operations. Micha made the controversial decision to illuminate the entire task force. Running lights, deck lights, searchlights, all blazing to guide returning aircraft home despite the risk of Japanese submarine attack. The carriers turned into the wind and began recovering aircraft in darkness. What followed tested everything the deck crews had learned. Aircraft returning with battle damage and minimal fuel needed priority landing. Damaged aircraft that could not safely trap needed to ditch near destroyers positioned for rescue. Aircraft that successfully landed needed immediate removal from the landing area to clear space for the next aircraft. All of this occurred in darkness, with exhausted pilots making approaches to carriers they could barely see. Deck crews performed with skill born from repeated practice. Landing signal officers guided aircraft down using illuminated paddles. Arresting gear crews reset cables within seconds after each landing. Aircraft handlers landed aircraft forward using procedures they could execute by feel in darkness. Medical teams stood ready to extract injured pilots. Crash crews waited with firefighting equipment for the inevitable deck crashes. 80 aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Another 49 crashed during landing attempts or were pushed overboard after damage. But through determined effort, the carriers recovered 196 aircraft and rescued all but 49 aircrew from the water. This represented extraordinary performance under the most difficult conditions carrier operations could face. The statistical analysis completed after the battle documented how far American carrier operations had progressed. Task Force 58 had launched over 400 sorties on June 19 alone. Carriers maintained combat air patrol overhead continuously for 18 hours. Fighter directors vectored intercepts against 4 separate Japanese raids, without allowing any to penetrate the fighter screen effectively. The task force launched a maximum range strike and recovered aircraft at night, despite losses that would have been catastrophic under pre-war procedures. These capabilities emerged directly from the innovations developed during previous combat operations. The flexible aircraft organization system that Commander Murray and Captain Mason had pioneered aboard Hornet in November 1943 was now standard across the fleet. The color-coded jersey system for flight deck crews had been adopted universally. Improved coordination between Air Department, Operations Department, and Engineering Department allowed carriers to operate at tempo impossible under old procedures. The Bureau of Aeronautics report, analyzing Philippine Sea operations, identified specific factors that contributed to American success. Radar-directed fighter interception had evolved into a highly effective system where controllers could manage dozens of aircraft simultaneously. Flight deck procedures allowed rapid launch of large strikes while maintaining reserves for defensive patrol. Improved maintenance practices kept higher percentages of aircraft operational despite intensive use. Better coordination between carriers in the task force allowed concentration of combat power at critical moments. Perhaps most significantly, the report noted that American carrier operations had become sustainably intensive. Task Force 58 had operated continuously for weeks before Philippine Sea without returning to port. Underway replenishment from tankers and supply ships allowed the carriers to remain at sea for months. This contrasted sharply with Japanese carrier operations, which required frequent port visits for maintenance and resupply. The Americans had developed a system that could maintain high operational tempo indefinitely, while the Japanese could not. The transformation continued through the remainder of 1944 and into 1945. Carriers operating off the Philippines during the Leyte campaign in October 1944 launched strikes in support of amphibious operations, while simultaneously defending against sustained Japanese air attacks. They demonstrated capability to conduct both offensive and defensive operations simultaneously, without degradation of either mission. During operations off Okinawa, in spring 1945, American carriers faced the most severe test of the war. Japanese kamikaze attacks targeted carriers specifically, recognizing them as the key to American naval power. The suicide tactics presented challenges different from conventional air attack. Damaged aircraft still crashed into targets if they maintained sufficient momentum. This required defensive procedures focused on destroying attackers at maximum range rather than simply damaging them. The defensive response demonstrated organizational learning under extreme pressure. Combat air patrols expanded to provide layered defense with fighters positioned at multiple distances and altitudes. Radar picket destroyers, stationed far from the main fleet, provided early warning that allowed earlier fighter interception. Fighter directors developed tactics that concentrated multiple aircraft against each threat. The carriers survived through adaptation rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. By summer 1945, American carrier operations had reached capabilities that would have seemed impossible in 1943. Task Force 38, operating off the Japanese home islands in July and August, launched over 13,000 sorties during that 2-month period. Carriers launched strikes against targets throughout Japan, while maintaining defensive patrols and conducting armed reconnaissance. They operated in weather conditions that would have grounded air operations earlier in the war. They sustained these operations despite typhoons, mechanical failures, and continuous enemy air attack. The numbers told the story. Average daily sortie rate per carrier had increased from 42 in August 1943 to 87 in July 1945. Aircraft availability rates improved from 63% to 78%, despite more intensive use. Time required to launch a full deck load strike decreased from 110 minutes to 34 minutes. These improvements came without changes to the carriers or aircraft. They resulted from better procedures developed through combat experience and disseminated throughout the fleet. The organizational learning process that drove these improvements followed patterns that modern analysis would recognize. Innovations emerged from personnel closest to problems rather than from distant headquarters. Successful practices spread through informal networks between carriers rather than through formal directives. Failures were analyzed quickly and corrections implemented immediately. The system empowered sailors to solve problems rather than wait for instructions. This contrasted with Japanese naval culture, where innovations required approval from senior officers who often lacked recent combat experience. Japanese carrier operations remained bound by pre-war doctrine that emphasized centralized control and formal procedures. When circumstances changed, Japanese carriers struggled to adapt because their organizational culture discouraged initiative from junior personnel. The American advantage was not superior technology or greater numbers, though both helped significantly. The fundamental advantage was an organizational culture that learned rapidly from experience. Deck crews aboard American carriers in 1945 bore little resemblance to crews that had struggled with basic operations in 1943. They had developed expertise through repeated practice under combat conditions. They had refined procedures through trial and error. They understood their equipment and each other well enough to operate effectively under the most stressful circumstances. The legacy of this evolution extended far beyond World War II. Post-war carrier operations incorporated lessons learned during the Pacific War. The principle that deck operations required coordination rather than mere execution of orders became foundational to carrier doctrine. Training emphasized adaptation and initiative rather than rigid procedure following. The colored jersey system for flight deck crews remained standard through multiple generations of carrier design. Modern supercarriers launching aircraft weighing 4 times what a Hellcat weighed, using steam catapults that did not exist in World War II, still organize flight deck operations according to principles developed between 1943 and 1945. The understanding that carriers are continuously operating systems rather than platforms that launch discrete missions emerged from combat experience in the Pacific. The recognition that successful operations require thinking sailors empowered to solve problems remains central to naval aviation culture. The statistical measure of achievement appears in operational tempo. Essex-class carriers designed to operate 90 aircraft sustained sortie rates that would have required 130 aircraft under 1943 procedures. They conducted these operations continuously for months rather than days. They maintained this performance despite battle damage, equipment failures, and exhaustion. This resilience came from procedures developed by sailors who refused to accept that existing methods were adequate. Commander George Murray and Captain Charles Mason, who pioneered flexible aircraft organization aboard Hornet in November 1943, received commendations for their contributions. Their innovations became so standard that by war's end, few remembered that carrier operations had ever worked differently. This represented the ultimate tribute. The system they developed became so obviously correct that it seemed inevitable rather than revolutionary. The flight deck crews who implemented these improvements received no special recognition. They were ordinary sailors, doing extraordinary work under impossible conditions. They spotted aircraft in darkness while the carrier pitched in heavy seas. They armed bombs and loaded ammunition while exhausted from 18-hour watches. They moved aircraft with precision that looked effortless, but required intense concentration and perfect coordination. They did this day after day, operation after operation, because the mission demanded it and their shipmates depended on them. The mechanics who kept aircraft operational despite battle damage and inadequate spare parts demonstrated similar dedication. They replaced engines on the flight deck during brief lulls between operations. They patched bullet holes using materials scavenged from aircraft beyond repair. They worked through exhaustion because the pilots who flew these aircraft were their friends, and keeping them flying kept them alive. The landing signal officers, who guided aircraft down through darkness, weather, and battle damage, showed courage that equaled any combat pilot. They stood exposed at the aft end of the flight deck where a single mistake or moment of inattention could kill them. They made split-second decisions that determined whether pilots lived or died. They did this hundreds of times per day, knowing that eventually they would miss a signal or misjudge an approach, and someone would die. These individual acts of skill and courage, multiplied across dozens of carriers and thousands of sailors, created the organizational capability that won the Pacific War. Not through single decisive battles, though those occurred, but through sustained operations that ground down Japanese military capability until resistance became impossible. The ability to launch 200 aircraft before breakfast, recover them by lunch, rearm them by afternoon, and launch another strike by evening gave the American fleet operational flexibility that the Japanese could never match. In the final analysis, carrier warfare was won not by admirals or pilots alone, but by everyone involved in the complex system that put aircraft over targets repeatedly and reliably. The innovations emerged from combat necessity rather than careful planning. The improvements spread through informal networks rather than formal channels. The culture that enabled this adaptation valued initiative over obedience, results over procedure, and problem-solving over blame. These qualities represented fundamental aspects of American military culture: trust in individual initiative, expectation that sailors should think independently, and recognition that those facing challenges understand them better than distant commanders. The sailors who revolutionized carrier operations during World War II demonstrated that preparation matters, that training saves lives, that questioning inadequate procedures represents professional responsibility, and that organizations succeed when they empower rather than constrain their people. Their example endures in modern naval operations, in training programs emphasizing adaptation and initiative, and in cultural expectations that sailors exercise independent judgment when circumstances require it. Most importantly, their legacy reminds us that wars are won not by technology or strategy alone, but by ordinary people refusing to accept defeat, finding ways to survive impossible situations, and persisting despite fear and exhaustion. The Fast Carrier Task Force dominated the Pacific from 1943 through 1945 because American sailors combined technical competence with tactical flexibility, because commanders like Murray and Mitchell empowered their crews beyond minimum standards, and because deck handlers, mechanics, and ordnance crews throughout the fleet developed practical solutions to novel problems. The color-coded jerseys, the flexible aircraft organization, the improved coordination between departments, the rapid maintenance procedures, the night recovery capabilities developed at Philippine Sea. These were not invented by engineers or mandated by headquarters. They emerged from sailors who wanted to survive and help their shipmates survive. They found ways to operate more effectively using available equipment and sharing what they learned so others could benefit. They modified procedures to meet tactical realities rather than merely following written instructions. They did what was necessary rather than merely what was authorized. This spirit of practical adaptation under pressure represents their most important legacy. Not specific procedures or equipment modifications, but the principle that effective naval forces empower sailors to think, adapt, and solve problems independently when circumstances demand it. The deck crews, maintainers, and aviation support personnel who transformed carrier operations between 1943 and 1945 left no detailed memoirs. Their innovations became so standard that history barely remembers them as innovations, but their work made victory possible. The story of the Essex-class carriers did not end with Japanese surrender in August 1945. What followed demonstrated that the innovations developed during World War II created a foundation adaptable enough to serve through 3 more decades of conflict and technological revolution. The carriers, designed to launch propeller-driven fighters weighing 7,000 pounds, would eventually operate jet aircraft weighing twice that much. The ships built for a specific war against Japan would serve in Korea, Vietnam, and throughout the Cold War. This adaptability was not accidental. The Essex class incorporated design features that allowed extensive modification without requiring complete rebuilding. The unarmored flight deck that had concerned some pre-war planners proved advantageous when carriers needed strengthening to handle heavier aircraft. The open hangar design that had created vulnerability to fire damage during kamikaze attacks allowed easier installation of new equipment. The spacious hull provided room for additional electronics, weapons systems, and crew accommodations as requirements changed. Most importantly, the operational culture developed during World War II persisted into the post-war Navy. The principle that deck crews needed to think independently and adapt procedures to circumstances remained central to carrier operations. The understanding that successful missions required coordination across departments rather than rigid adherence to prescribed roles continued guiding training and operations. The recognition that combat experience generated better procedures than theoretical planning informed how the Navy approached modernization. When the Korean War began in June 1950, only 4 Essex-class carriers remained in active service. The rest sat in reserve, maintained but not manned. Within months, the Navy had recommissioned multiple carriers and begun extensive modernization programs. The urgency of war funding, combined with recognition that Essex-class carriers remained highly capable, platforms drove a modernization effort that would extend their service life for another 40 years. The first major modification program, designated SCB-27 Alpha, began in 1952. 8 carriers underwent reconstruction that strengthened their flight decks to handle heavier aircraft, installed more powerful hydraulic catapults, upgraded arresting gear, improved aviation fuel systems, and modernized electronics. The work required cutting away significant portions of the original structure and rebuilding to improved specifications. The reconstruction took between 15 and 20 months per carrier, but created vessels capable of operating first-generation jet aircraft effectively. The most revolutionary innovation came not from American engineers, but from British naval aviation. In 1952, the Royal Navy tested a concept called the angled deck. Instead of landing along the center line of the carrier with crash barriers protecting parked aircraft forward, the landing area angled several degrees to port. Aircraft that missed the arresting wires could simply add power and go around for another attempt rather than crashing into barriers or parked aircraft. The U.S. Navy immediately recognized the significance. USS Antietam, an Essex-class carrier, received experimental angled deck modifications in December 1952. A sponson extending from the port side created a landing area canted 10.5 degrees from the ship's centerline. 6 arresting wires were installed perpendicular to the angled landing area. The portside elevator was locked in the raised position to clear space for the angled deck extension. Testing began in January 1953. Pilots from the Naval Air Test Center flew 350-day approaches and 26 night approaches using F-9 F Panthers, F-2H Banshees, F-3D Sky Knights, and AD Sky Raiders. The results exceeded expectations. Landing accidents decreased dramatically. Aircraft that missed all wires could go around safely. Simultaneous launch and recovery operations became possible with aircraft launching from the bow while others landed on the angled deck. The deck parking area forward remained clear of landing aircraft traffic. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.